So for our first panel, we wanted to reflect a little on the history of the Bureau and understand what we can learn from the past when visioning for the future. So past research here in the Bureau and the college defined and framed many important ideas and practices that have become part of the fabric of education. For example, the concept of inquiry was once renewed and implemented through research in the university primary school, but is now commonplace. The Bureau was not reflective of its time, but was ahead of thinking about what was needed to improve education. So, in today's history panel, we want to ask two basic questions. What were the most important things from education research in the past that carry weight for us today? And what advice does the panel have for thinking about the future of the Bureau? I want to add that we'd like also to get everyone else's advice on this. We've set up a form on the Celebration webpage to solicit any advice that you have from the audience on what should the Bureau be thinking about and doing in the future. So please look at that and fill that in. Our panelists here, collectively, we added it up, they represent some 156 years of research in the College of Education. So let me introduce them. So Fuad Al-Khalik joins us today from North Carolina, where he's now the Dean of the College of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Back in 2000, he joined our faculty as a Professor of Science Education here in the College of Education and soon began working with the Bureau.
Testing. Try it now that this is off. See if it.
Is this one?
Actually, if you want this,
okay.
We know that.
Okay, is this better? So back in 2000, Fuad joined our faculty as a Professor of Science Education here in the College of Education and soon began working with the Bureau. He quickly secured campus seed funding and became a Bureau Faculty Fellow. He then applied for and led several NSF-funded projects with close Bureau support. The last of these projects was a 6-year-long research centre for entrepreneurial science teaching. He served as Department Head for Curriculum Instruction before becoming the Associate Dean for Research in 2013. Carolyn Anderson received her PhD in Quantitative Psychology from Illinois in 1993 and joined the Department of Educational Psychology immediately afterwards. As an expert in quantitative methods, she is frequently sought out for her expertise in research design. She received Bureau fellowships twice to conduct research, both independently and with her collaborators. Walter Feinberg joined the faculty in 1967 in the Department of then Educational Policy Studies and a member of the Bureau. After the Bureau was reorganized, he continued to receive Bureau support. As a Bureau Fellow, he was able to complete one of his several scholarly books. He was named the first Charles Hardy Dunn Professor of Educational Policy in 2004 and is now an emeritus faculty member. Bill Koch came to Illinois from Australia in 2006 to join the Department of Educational Policy Studies. His research program explores the pedagogical affordances of technology-mediated learning environments, and he is a historian by training. And then Dick Anderson joined Illinois in 1963 in the newly created Department of Educational Psychology. He has led the Center for the Study of Reading, which received 15 years of major funding from the US Department of Education starting back in 1976. At its peak, this center employed 100 faculty, research staff and students. The center's work has continued and became a unit of the Bureau in 1995. Dr. Anderson is also a member of the National Academy of Education. He's been an emeritus professor since 2010, but continues to maintain a full and active program of mentoring and research, including on-site projects with collaborators at Beijing Normal University. So this is a few of our panelists. So we'll start then with Fuad, who is going to offer a summary of the Bureau's most recent 30 years, and then turn to the other panelists who are going to amplify the accomplishments, issues and opportunities that they have seen in the Bureau. So,
good morning. First of all, it's so good to be back here. I want to thank Jim and Gabrielle for inviting me back. So I'm here with Lama and the kids, and Farah, who's now 6, was 3 when we left, and we were driving back, and yesterday she said, "I'm back home." It's like, what do you remember? So the thing that is, I want everybody to do, go see those slides and understand what a gem this College of Education is, and what a gem this Bureau of Education and Research is. When you hear names like David Ausubel and Lee Crumbach, and when you learn about Jim and George McConkie and Bob Lynn and Dick Anderson and people that have been through this place, and I'm not going to be comprehensive, please keep that in mind. But the reason I say this is to think about how the Bureau of Education and Research has been pivotal in the history of this school. And I'm not going to talk to highlights of education and research topics or content. There are people here who can speak better to that. What I want to speak to is, as now somebody who does administration, is the structures and affordances that are tied to a vision when you are doing this work. And I say that because this Bureau has been such an adaptive unit that time after time, sort of like leader after leader, taking on this school, taking on this Bureau, have been able to respond to what I would characterize as some changing epochs in educational research. And so I came here, Gabrielle, not as a professor, but as a first-year assistant professor. I went through the ranks to associate and full. Then I was head of CNI for 4 years, and then associate dean for research for 2 years, with 1 year of overlap in being department head, and that's important in the story, and I'll tell you why. And it's not my goal to give you a brief bio of what I've done here, but to tell you that at every phase of that journey, the Bureau of Education and Research was there for me, and then as a vehicle to allow us as the school to go places. So if you look at the history, and there's going to be exceptions, and I'm going to use examples that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure you can generate your own. But by and large, when you think about how the Bureau of Education Research started, the name suggests that it's a unit within schools and colleges of education that does research. And that's what schools and colleges of education did. Remember, we grew up from normal tradition of preparing teachers. Most of these schools and colleges had also home economics in them, teaching women to cook and sew. And so the notion of starting to move into the field of engaging in education and research has to be scaffolded back then. So the Bureau of Education and Research here was created to be a home where education and research was done, right? And if you think, for example, about the big golden era of curriculum development, biological sciences curriculum study, physical science curriculum study, mathematics curriculum study, which was here at the University of Illinois. People need to remember that the original math curricula of the golden era came out of this school. There was not much research going on. Actually, many of you know the people, like Glenn Aikenhead, who was doing a PhD in Harvard to start assessing the impact of biological sciences curriculum study and the physical science curriculum study of the 1960s. He just retired 2 years ago. And so the Bureau started as a place where people came in to do research, and in many ways, it was a unit within the School of Education. And until quite recently, and the reason I could patch this history is having talked with Zandy Stefano and many people here, when you were a Bureau Fellow, you left your department in this building, whether you're in CNI or Special Ed or EPS or HRD before we kind of reorganized under Mary, you left your office and went to an office in the Bureau and took leave. Leave of what? That's really interesting, right? Maybe it's leave of teaching, leave of curriculum development, leave from working in the schools, and went to the Bureau to do research. And so the Bureau at that point, the Bureau of Education Research, was in many ways saying more research needs to happen in schools and colleges of education. Now, of course, there are some exceptions where there's been deep research going on for many, many years, but somebody like Dick Anderson created their own sort of enterprise for doing research. Now, research in education was growing, and we moved from the era of having to have a few people in a school or college of education do research and this is evident usually if you think about schools and colleges of education, where our graduates became our professors. Think about that. And then up to the 1990s, you took leave, you came to the Bureau. But then the era of what I would like to sort of say, and you know, I tell it as I say, it doesn't mean it's right, the changing landscape of funding in higher ed, right? When I first came here and I applied for my first grant, my neighbor who was a tenured professor told me, oh, we'd love you if you get money, but we're not going to tenure you. You need to publish the articles. And you could see a shift back then where you were expected to come, publish, and maybe become an associate professor in full and then go after some big monies. That was a way of sort of engaging in educational research. And what was interesting that the changing landscape of the funding of higher ed, as well as the changing landscape of the pressures for getting quote-unquote big money, started to be imported from the sciences, which for us, or people in the science knew, was part of the history of doing the science into education. I came out from a PhD program where I was told, don't get big grants, they just tie down your research agenda. So when I came here as a first-year assistant professor, I did not know what ICR was. That's indirect cost recovery for you. Now as dean, this is like something I really care about. I did not know what fast lane looked like. And so when I first raised my hand to apply for a research grant, I was directed down to the Bureau. So I went down to the Bureau, and Lizanne was like, wait, that's not how it works. We have a ladder for you, which is really interesting. There were scaffolds, and the ladder was you applied for a $10,000 grant, which was the Bureau Fellowship, and they took 5,000 of those, gave them to CNI, released you from teaching, and then took the other 5 and did something with them, collecting data, doing some proof of concept, getting yourself ready for submitting grants. And after you get through that, then you go and say, hey, you applied to the campus Bureau of Research, right? And so I now got to the second step of the ladder. We applied, and I remember getting some $30,000, $40,000 to go out and sort of collect some data. The reason I'm talking about these things is because that was a shift from the Bureau being a place where it was in the building residential way for doing research, to people expected to do research, to people now expected to get big money. So as a first-year assistant professor with like wide eyes, not doing anything about research, I went down and Beth was there, Lizanne was there, and they said, you bring the ideas, we'll take care of the rest. And that was an ethos for the Bureau of Education Research that has both positives and negatives, and I'll talk about it. But pretty much we had an idea, and we reached out to Lenny Pitt in computer science, Matt Sellen in physics, right, and Ed Dole in biology, and we just submitted this grant. We got it, which was like, beginner's luck, was a $900,000 grant. But back then, very few people in the School of Ed or College of Ed had reached out across campus to do these kinds of collaborations, right? And it was motivated in many ways by big monies. The other really important thing is, as you moved forward, the Bureau handed you off to the post-award operation in the school. I did not know where to submit my first annual report for my grant. And I say that because it's not trivial. The machinery of doing this kind of big education research has always been built in the DNA of the sciences, right? But we were trying to build it into the DNA of education. Moving along forward, it seems that we were trying to understand how we can move from what I like to call victimization, which is, oh, we're education, we're poor, all the monies are up there on the northern side of campus, and move into sort of saying, what's the biggest gorilla on this campus, and let's work with that. And I think that was really interesting because remember what Lizanne DeStefano had to do back then, and I know her ears are ringing now. She went and did that evaluation study for women in science, women engineering for them. And we would go and talk to people in engineering and sort of say, hey, you have that 10% monies that NSF forces you to do some education. Can we help you with that? That's how this relationship started. We were an afterthought. But that helped us sort of get into inroads with many folks at the other side of campus that when we went for our next big grant, which was the Enlist grant, which was the Entrepreneur Leadership in STEM Teaching and Learning, now we were sitting with engineers, scientists, people in business, together at the table, under the auspices and the facilitation of the Bureau, thinking about the next big grant. So that was a major shift for us, where two things were being sort of envisioned at the Bureau. That it's the era of big education research. Now the idea of going out and being big, securing funding, and it's not just about the money. I always tell my faculty is there's one of you and 24 hours a day. No matter how smart you are, no matter how great you are, that is a formula that's not changing. So what does the money do? It gives you bandwidth. And the sciences have understood this a long time ago, right? And so they invented the postdocs. We're now following that. They invented the training institutes. We're now following that. And so when we did that kind of work, the Bureau has already now starting to sort of think, how can I build strategic relationships across campus? So it moved from being an in-the-building residential research place to being an engine for getting all of us to go out and be in the world of funding, to now being the builder of interdisciplinary research. It started reaching out into the campus. Now, remember, it had always reached out into communities. It always reached out to the state in its history. But I thought from where I stood that this was really interesting. And the reason I mentioned that kind of overlap between the 1 year when I was head of CNI and then Bureau Director, that was another really interesting thing, because back then, if I recall well, Mary and I cornered Ade and his chief financial officer in my office there, and we said we had this great search that we were looking for a future educational technology people, and we had these amazing three people, Rob Lindgren, Emma Mercier, and Dan Hoffman back then, and we said, can you give us a cluster hire? Remember, there wasn't a cluster hire back then. And we locked the door and said, you're not going to leave before you do something like this. But you see, what we had done before that, we had showed him what Rob Lindgren has done, and what Emma have done in that sense. And right there, he said yes, if you remember. And we got these three people here. And what we had promised them, did we even have the money? I'm not sure. What we would promise them is that we're going to build them a state-of-the-art laboratory of the future. And I remember Rob and Emma, and I remember Dan giving us this crazy list of stuff. So here you are, CNI, promising doing a cluster hire in CNI, and promising the building of a state-of-the-art laboratory. How would that fly? That wouldn't fly in a college of education. Because where are the other players? And so that's then when we shifted this from CNI and sort of said the Bureau of Education Research is going to build you this laboratory. And this laboratory is going to be everybody's laboratory in the School of Education. So what was really interesting in the pivot we've done at that point in time was that the Bureau of Education Research is now starting to become a strategic center for not only building partnerships by facilitating relationships, but starting to move into another era of education and research, which is large interdisciplinary production of things as compared to just researching the outcomes of interventions. And so, if you recall, when I walked into the Bureau, we built that ideal laboratory based on Delta, which was built in CNI, and there was a lot of humbug. Right? We created a lot of interest in the school, and then we started wanting people to be visioning themselves as part of this enterprise. And so Dan was helping us get Chad Lane. Is Chad here? Chad Lane. Then we got Luke Paquette, right? Because what we were doing right then is we're starting to build a college-wide enterprise. So what's interesting is the Bureau has moved from a place where you go and sit and do research and being isolated from the school by giving you time to be a place that's now building structures and scaffolds for people to come in and then go back to their departments and do that kind of work, which I thought was interesting for the way we did this. And that's where we reorganized the Bureau, and that's where Beth, who sort of was the pre-award person, became the director of strategic initiatives, right? And the story is a little bit more complex because Mary Calancis has sneaked into the strategic planning exercise of Phyllis Wise this thing that was called the Learning Sciences Design Laboratory, right? And I don't know how you did this, but we sort of thought, oh, look at this, Learning Sciences Design Laboratory. These relationships were now building. We had this big opening. People from engineering came and they said, oh, these people know something about technology. Maybe we can talk with them. And from there, I think we launched, and I can, you know, it's a longer history. We launched the Learning Sciences Design Initiative. And back then, it was a different posture, I think, like the posture you guys are doing now. We went to Andreas Candelaris and said, we're throwing $100,000 on the table, would you put $100,000? And then we went to Arts and Science and said, hey, Andreas just put $100,000, would you put $100,000? And this notion, again, is not about the money. It's about education starting to position itself as a player on this campus. To sort of say, why did we have Play-Doh and it failed? You know, why did we invent email on this campus and it wasn't used in education? And it goes on and on. And we had the conversation of sort of saying, we could be partners with you in sort of figuring out how this place could now produce educational technologies for the future, digital technologies for the future, rather than just figuring out that our job in education is to figure out what's the next Texas Instruments calculator and how can mathematics educators use that. I know that Rihanna hates that. Sort of like, we can't keep chasing things thrust upon us, but how can we start creating technologies for doing this? And so the Learning Sciences Design Initiative opened a whole host of doors for us. And we were facilitating that. We were creating seed funding. We were bringing interdisciplinary. In this room, we had that first luncheon. I don't know that, Gabrielle, you were here, but in this room, we created this first luncheon, and we had engineers. I know we have folks from engineering here, and we created those interdisciplinary teams and moved them forward. And it's just transformed the way we can position ourselves. And this is what I'm trying to do now in Chapel Hill, because I went down there, I said, okay, what do you do? Oh, we're poor, nobody deals with us, we have no respect. I said, what's the biggest girl on campus? Well, it's medicine. Now we're going to work with medicine, right? I don't have a Bureau of Education Research. If I can pluck the people here and move them down there, I'll do it today. So, and I'm trying to invent the Bureau of Education Research. I have to figure out a different name for it, but so what is the dynamic? What is the soup that was doing this and enabling these kinds of transformations? You have to figure it out. We have to figure it out, because how could this be a relevant entity for such a long, long time and always being responsive, not falling out of favor or not falling out of role is very important. From there on, the sky was the limit. I just happened to, by virtue of the position of being Associate Dean for Research, Learning Science Design Initiative, we were now players in the Siebel Center for Design, which was not even Siebel Center for Design. This morning I was taking photos with that bloody thing, because to go from paper, to go from programming, to go from me learning about BEAM, which is the virtual system that contractors use to build buildings. Don't ask me why I learned about it, but we were the people selecting the builders, right? What I'm trying to say is, if you want to engage in partnerships across this campus, you want to do all of this stuff. And the Bureau was the infrastructure that allowed us to do that. Back then, we even said, hey, the School of Education is ahead of you. We have all these wonderful educational learning, sort of future-looking classrooms, and we called them part of the design network on campus, because we didn't want the School of Education, not to be neighbors with that thing. So looking across all of these changes in the Bureau, the question now is, what is next? And that's something for you to think about. I've just been lucky sort of picking Gabrielle's mind every time I saw her at the AAU Dean's meeting, at the Learn. And the next thing that the Bureau needs maybe to position itself towards is ask, what are the grand challenges in education? Right? Digital literacy. But one thing we know in education is we don't have common grand challenges. And this is not my observation, this is Gabrielle's observation. So that's another broad conversation that maybe the Bureau of Education Research can lead moving forward. this is the era of big education research, big challenges. This is the era where we need to start seeing ourselves in all of our diversity, from the sort of case study ethnography all the way to randomized controlled trials. We have shifted, and we need to both celebrate all of these things and follow these changes in the Bureau. Anybody remembers when Russ Whitehurst came to this school in 2001 or 2002 to tell us about RCTs, and we're going to throw chairs at him? Remember that? That's beyond us now. We were sitting there deciding how we're going to, kick him out of the building, because how dare we do RCTs in education? Now they're sort of becoming part of the lexicon and part of our tools. So you've seen our educational research changing, and now we're not putting something on the side and celebrating something else. We understand all of this framework, we understand all of these methodologies, we understand their potential. The question, how can we become not only relevant, that's a question we folded, how can we be partners in impacting the future of education, and how could this Bureau of Education Research continue to lead and have all these wonderful people, you, be the arms and be the minds and be the bandwidth that will help this Bureau, this college, and the field of education become better. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that great history. Just reminded me of a whole lot of things, and seeing as we're talking in this kind of personal narrative kind of way, I've been here now, well, Mary and I have been here for 13 years, unbelievably. I can't believe it. It sort of seems like yesterday that we came here. And before we came here, we'd done a lot of research in Australia and got a lot of grants. And in fact, for most of my career, I've been just a researcher. I hadn't taught. I'd just been a full-time researcher, and I spent my life getting grants, and I got a lot of them. And then after that, I became the head of a grant-giving agency in Australia, in the federal government. So I was at both ends of it, getting grants and managing grant programs. And when I came here, it was a strange experience, to be quite frank. I'm going to tell you, folks, this is a funny country. And what I encountered was a particular set of protocols for getting educational research, which was the RCT regime that Whitehurst set up, which, by the way, excludes the work that Jim and Chris do in history, excludes the work that Wally does in philosophy. So it actually involves a lot of exclusions, and it involves a certain definition of research. Now, I'd never done this stuff myself because, as someone said, I'm a historian. That's what I was trained to be. And I say facetiously that I'm not qualified to do anything I do. But I've learned other things, since. So anyhow, I came here and Lisanne sort of showed us the formula, and I learned funny things like fidelity. What a strange notion fidelity is, which is the teacher has to do exactly what they're told in an identical templated way for this thing to be faithful to the research design. I thought, oh my goodness, this is such a peculiar methodology, because in fact we want outliers, we want experimentation, there's going to be difference whether we like it or not. So I thought, okay, this is just a set of practices and rituals which are the gatekeeping things, which actually, to be blunt about it from my perspective, was the agenda of what works, turning education into instrumental rationality. What works, the clearinghouse, instrumental rationality. We don't want social agendas, we don't want broader things happening, because that's political, and educators are notoriously political a lot of the time. So if we turn it into a series of mechanisms, it strips that away. So anyhow, Lisanne was, and this is one of the wonderful things about the Bureau, and subsequently in the Bureau as well, she wrote the methodology bit of the first IES grant we got, and then we got another 4 or 5 after that. And I just kept using the formula, and so the Bureau then, for us, for Mary and I, performed this kind of enculturation role, which was the Bureau knew how things got done. And look, since then, we've had grants from NSF as well, and also money from the Gates Foundation. So we've continued to do this and got a lot of things done because look, you know, realistically, getting things done is about not, you know, working with systems, working with protocols, whatever they are, even if you're slightly uncomfortable with them. But the most important thing for us really was the fact that this institution is a very generously collaborative place. So there's the people in Beth's role and the people who preceded her who do budgets. I'd never had anybody do a budget for me before. In Australia, when I did grants, I did them all myself. And I'd never had anybody, so all the apparatus that sits around it, but also to have people who were conversant with methodology, who knew what fidelity was and knew how to do fidelity with faithfulness. So we did all of that. But actually, one of the other parts of the experience here has been the way in which it's been possible to network across the university. So Mary and I have worked with people in computer science, people in computational linguistics. We've also done work in medicine and veterinary medicine. And people are very collaborative, and we would never have got any of these grants without that. So to give you an example, Mary and I spent the last 2 years every Friday afternoon in computer science, and I've even ended up being on computer science students' committees as an advisor, even though I'm not qualified at anything, but I'm not qualified at that particularly. And along the way, it's been an environment which fosters learning. I understand RCT now, for better and for worse. I feel as if I can't do what computer scientists do, but I feel as if I understand what they do and how it might be used. And likewise, we're in these collaborative relationships where the CS people find it valuable to have insights about what education would be beyond A, B, C, D answers that you add up kind of thing. So, you know, that's what I'm trying to capture with this is a kind of a sense of the atmosphere and the dynamics which have made this a very productive place for us. So since Mary and I have been here, we've got you know, 4 authored books done, and we've got a whole pile of articles done and a whole pile of research. But it's not the products which are important, it's the fact that we've been in an atmosphere which has been congenial to that work. And we've learned an incredible lot. And one of the things that we've been struggling with, particularly over the last year or two, last several years, is what kinds of paradigm shifts are we in the middle of at the moment? And if you want me to be kind of eschatological about this, that this is a moment in education which is really quite fundamental transformation. So Jim captures around this word digital, but it's big in the sense that the dynamics of human interchange in education are changing really, really dramatically. And we have, under these cliched terms, machine learning and artificial intelligence. What did education do in its first research phase? It did intelligence testing. So we're back to intelligence, except now it's artificial. And what's the human relationship in artificial intelligence? And we have this thing called machine learning, where machines are capable of self-improvement in collaboration with human beings. And this is an incredibly interesting moment, which I actually feel, and that's another long argument which I won't go into, that it actually transcends all the paradigms that we've had around psychometrics, around RCTs and whatever, and the whole big data, artificial intelligence regime, even breaks down the distinction between quantitative and qualitative work, which has been historically part of our regime. So what we have here in the Bureau at the moment is an incredibly important role to struggle with this paradigm shift in the nature of knowledge, the way the research happens, but also the very, very structure of schooling, the way in which human beings interact in, with, through, beside machines in educational settings. So we've got a huge agenda ahead of us, and in a way what we have, it's, you know, the cliche, the Isaac Newton cliche about standing on the shoulders of giants. We can do that, but also we've got a big agenda ahead of us as well.
Well, so far we have not talked very much about history, which is the title of our panel. So
You know something about that.
I know a little, some years of history of this college. And Gabrielle asked us to reflect on what some of the great accomplishments were and those who historically contributed to it. I think this school has been notable for research on teaching of different kinds. And someone who I guess was not affiliated with the Bureau started or was a part of a revolution in ideas about teaching, Max Biberman and the new mathematics. And there was a historical movement of that time of improving instruction in the major disciplines in middle school and high school. And I suppose he was part of that movement, but really he was one of the great leaders of that movement. In the Bureau, we had a significant figure in the history of research on teaching, Nate Gage. He wasn't the only one. I think his sidekick, Lee Schulman, would deserve a lot of credit for turning attention toward teaching, the nature of teaching, the teacher's job. I think we need to understand in the digital revolution that apparently is happening, what's the role of all these human beings going to be? We've had others who've contributed in a certain way to research on teaching. Another name historically important in this college is B. Othaniel Smith, Bunny Smith, a great student of teaching, not much of an empiricist, though he tried to get started on looking into classrooms and seeing what teaching was about. Barak Rosenshine, an eccentric figure here for many years, spent his whole career trying to understand teaching, what teachers did that made a difference, what teachers did that didn't make a difference. At the Center for the Study of Reading, I would single out Anne Brown and Anne-Marie Palinsar in the tradition of inventing a new way of doing things with their approach called reciprocal teaching. While wandering along, as others here have before me have done, I feel if we step back a bit, we should ask not how many grants you got, how much money you had, but did you discover anything important that may have changed your field? We did a few things at the Center for the Study of Reading, which have had a rather permanent influence on the way people in reading, language arts, language education look at their work. No one today doubts the role of what the student already knows and how this affects their processes when they sit down with a book. A lot of us contributed to that. Bill Brewer is sitting here. The marvelous work that he and Stella Bosniato did on children's conception of the Earth and the Earth's position in relation to the moon, the sun, and other solar bodies. A beautiful example of research with staying power, which contributed mightily to our understanding of the role of what the student already knows and what they're going to be able to learn today. Well, I've been here going on more than 50, going on 60 years. Certainly, When I got here, I just missed Kronbach and Gage. They'd left for Stanford, which was the hot place to be then. I was left with my smartest colleague, I guess, was David Ausubel. Well, he was an original. There was only one David Ausubel, and we can call him a pioneering cognitive psychologist. He certainly was running against the tide of his time, but he was a really, really strange guy. The social form in those days was the open house. So in the college then, it was 5 to 7 for some reason. Seems like you can't have a roaring party from 5 to 7, can you? So my wife and I invited Dave and Pearl Ausubel over, and just the two of them. And Dave's guy, you know, he could say, "Hello, how are you?" "Fine, fine." "Nice day today." "Yep, nice day." And that was kind of the extent of his conversational mood. So we sat there for about an hour and a half, chattering away, while Dave and Pearl sat and looked blankly into space. Barak Rosenshine was a character, a unique individual. More of you will know Barak. You remember the strange practice in the 60s and 70s called streaking? Well, I didn't see it, but Barak did it at a major conference. Streaked behind the person giving the presidential address. Let's see if I can make this to a more sober note. I guess I'm going to wander on to the topic of RCTs. You know, I've just had a chance to review the kind of summary of the summaries of the Reading for Understanding initiative of the Institute of Educational Science. They spent $120 million over 6 years, and they let you fool around for a while, but then you had to do your RCT. Well, there's some significant effect sizes. Catherine Snow, who's got to be one of our leaders in literacy education, and has an innovation that looks like it has the right stuff in it. She ran an RCT randomly assigning schools to treatments. She had 7,000 children. I don't even know how many classrooms. Well, she got a significant effect size on a transfer to a standardized comprehension test. 0.1, an effect size of 0.1. For heaven's sakes, how's that going to change education? And that was one of the better results. So probably there were some good ideas in these programs. Too bad we don't know very much about what those teachers and children were doing. We do know a lot about the statistical model, which no doubt was just the cat's pajamas, and the tests that were given. Did we waste 120 million? Did we turn off funding agencies? to educational research? Well, that was a sober thought, wasn't it?
How do you follow that? I kind of talk a little bit about the Bureau and its impact on me. I was again assistant professor and was told, you have to get a grant to get tenure. My first thought was, why would anybody want to give me money? But I became a Bureau fellow, and I went back to the literature, and I can still remember that gave me blocks of time I could actually go back and look at some interesting papers that I kind of, I saw it when I was doing my dissertation, but I didn't do anything with it. And I can still remember sitting and staring at this one equation thinking, this is an entirely different literature, but that's seen in other literatures. Well, it turned into a grant on my first time ever writing a grant. So I had the idea, wrote up my ideas, and I just gave it to the Bureau, and they did everything else. I would have never gotten the grant if it hadn't been for the Bureau, fund supporting me, and then doing all the rest of the things involved with the grant. One thing that hasn't, when I first started in the college, 80% of the tenured faculty were men. Things have changed dramatically. There was no family policy. I had a child my first semester, but one thing I do want to talk about is the history of women in the college. A lot of them that were not faculty, but were doing educational research. They were tended to be wives of professors. Elizabeth Easley, Jack Easley's wife. She passed away recently, but I saw all the things that she contributed. She wrote papers. She did almost everything, but she wasn't tenured. Kumi Tatsuoka was a big name now in psychometrics. She worked alongside her husband, Maurice Tatsuoka, in areas of psychometrics. Bob Stake's wife also contributed writing, and I have no idea. Those are only 3 examples, but I have a feeling there were others that I just don't know about.
Actually, Courtney Kasdan's one of the most famous. Her husband was in a different college, but she was here.
Right, but these were women that weren't recognized for their contributions. And so I did want to bring that out. Things are much a friendlier place. We've got a lot more women that are tenured. As far as the biggest, because of my background in psychometrics and quantitative psychology, I know more about the contributions of people like Maurice Tatsuoka, Ledger Tucker, Terry Ackerman. Probably many of you have known, unless you're in psychometrics, have heard these, but you talk to any psychometric person and they'll say, oh yeah, I know the work that they did. A lot of it was in testing and measurement. Some of it starting for World War II. But, so this has always been a very strong methods program, college. In conjunction with psychology, we probably had, at times, the best psychometric quantitative psychology group in the world. I mean, you just couldn't fit. And it's been great to see the college picking up and carrying that tradition on. We've got some great young faculty members that I can see as being leaders in the field. in the coming years. I know that in terms of the Bureau, that a lot of times I was asked to be a quantitative person on a grant because IES wants somebody that knows statistics in order to get funded. So I played that role quite a bit, but I also have my own research program. So, but as my career was well established in my own area, that allowed me to then participate in grants for others. Currently, though, I see a lot more collaboration. A group that I'm working with now includes faculty from Insight, high school, engineering, ECE, and computer science. All coming together with our unique skills and knowledge to study online education. I have some strong opinions about online education, but I won't state them here. I guess one of the things that always sticks in my mind is my son hates classes where he has to memorize things. Because, well, I can always just Google it. Why do I have to memorize it? And I think I couldn't convince him otherwise yet. But anyways, I will pass it on.
I just have two corrections about my introduction. First, I wasn't appointed to the Department of Educational Policy Studies because at the time, what became the Department of Educational Policy Studies was the Department of History and Philosophy of Education, which is important for what I want to say. The other thing was I was not appointed to the Bureau when I came. I was selected in a competition the first year the Bureau changed from a permanent appointment to a competitive appointment. Those two things are important for the point that I want to make is that, and this is related to what Dean Anderson said, the college when I came in had a culture that not only protected but valued the humanities. And this was a really unique part of this College of Education. The philosophy division in this college had the reputation of being the strongest in this country and one of two in the world. That was because the college protected it and valued it. And my appointment to the Bureau, as I think I was an assistant or a beginning associate professor, uncertain of my own capacity to contribute to something in the college because my degree was not from education, so I didn't know a lot about education. But when I was appointed to the Bureau, it signified to me that the college really valued the kind of work that I did, and the kind of work that I did not bring in money. And it still doesn't. I mean, when I finally finished after 40 years here, the Spencer Foundation was very kindly supporting quite a bit of my work. But up until that point, I was not, and was not expected to be, a grant getter. And I think that there was, at that point, a real sense of the role of a college of education as an intellectual in place in a university. Yes, meeting external needs, but also serving to help define what those needs are and what they should be. And that made a big difference because when I came, I'm junior to Dick by a lot of years, probably 4. But
yes, 4,
exactly. when we first started, when I came, There were, I think, there was 1 or 2 women on the faculty. There was no African American faculty member in the college, and there may have been 2 in the university. I'm not sure. That was normal. I mean, when I came in, I didn't ask, where are all the African American faculty and why don't you have any women here? That was just the way things were. It was what you stepped into, the world that you lived in at the time. Now, that broke because at the time there was stuff going on. There was a civil rights movement, there were marches, there were protests over the Vietnam War. And some of the faculty, especially in the department of what became Educational Policy Studies, became the leaders within the college of reflecting those movements. And as those movements were reflected, 2 things changed. One, we began to notice the fact that we were all white, and it took us a while to also notice that we were all male. That took a little bit longer. And it also brought about a significant change in the way in which research was thought of, what counts as good research. Up until that point, good research in education was defined as research that can get as close as possible to research in the natural sciences. And that meant that physics was the model of good research in education, and the closest you could get were controlled statistical studies and maybe some experimental work. But that was largely it. Then, due to the work of Bob Stake, Alan Peshkin, and also one of our most prominent quantitative research, Lee Kronbach, who was always sensitive to the gaps in the work that he was doing and pushed for more philosophical and more qualitative understanding of the research work that people do. Due to people like that, the research model began to open up. It wasn't that the work of Tatsuoka and others were dismissed, it was that other kinds of input into the picture of what education is began to emerge. And that part of it was an important sense to me of what the humanities contribute to education. What they contribute is a self-reflection and a self-understanding, and a way in which we open up what we do as educators to the influences of a larger community and how we can help both incorporate those influences and help guide them. And I think this is one of the things that this college and the Bureau has done throughout its history.
This is on the record, so it's important. I'm not advocating RCTs by any shape or form as a golden standard. I've never done an RCT myself, but we need to grow up. We are at, I think, a moment where we have good understanding of the various methodologies, and we need to be driven by questions. We shouldn't be in education at a place where I have to defend having a humanitarian perspective, or an experimental perspective, or a psychological perspective, or sociocultural perspective. I think we have a good understanding of the benefits and burdens of all of these things. We need to be driven by good questions, which need to be driven by big challenges. We're talking about digital literacy. In my state, 45% of kids don't read by grade 3. What are we doing about that? What the Bureau needs to do, what a College of Education needs to do, is move beyond the validation of different lenses and sort of say, if we have a grand challenge, how can we become a tool all together working to address all of this? An RCT doesn't tell me what's happening in a good classroom, a qualitative researcher will. And goes on and on. The other thing is, let's please stop being apologetic about spending money. I'm going to give you two figures. The F-35, the worst development of a fighter jet in the history of the US, has cost $35 billion as of yet, and the thing cannot bloody damn fly. Another figure to keep in mind, the US Army spends every year $70 billion to deal with rust on their ships, planes, and equipment. So let us waste $120 million and figure out whether we can do something to help kids read. That's what I wanted to say by us having to become a big discipline on our own. Stop being apologetic about what we think to be big resources, because we have the biggest problems. Have you heard about these Army ships having collisions these days? Those kids don't know mathematics. Once those things shut down, they can't run the bloody ships. So that's what I want us to say. Grand challenges. All of us need to come together to deal with these grand challenges in synergistic ways. And we know how to do that. A grand challenge or set of challenges for the Bureau, bringing us all together within and without this campus and beyond. That's the way to move forward. We need to stop being apologetic about what we do and about the importance of our disciplines. Thank you.
Just to move from that, I'd like to have one quick question for the panel, and then so we can see if there's time for questions from the audience. Bill mentioned particularly like what is happening with artificial intelligence and deep learning. We're going to be able to model the human brain within 20 years or so and understand at a fundamental level how the brain works. And Fuad was talking about the importance of grand challenges as motivating things. So I'd like to ask the panel just for a very quick response on what you think. What would be a grand challenge that we could uniquely take on in Illinois that would be something that the Bureau could be a catalyst for? So, I don't know who wants to start, but just what is a big grand challenge problem in education that you'd be excited for us to address?
This semester I've been teaching at Danville Correctional Institute, and I've been teaching a course in American Pragmatism. And just to give you a sense of it, I have in my class an older gentleman, almost my age, not quite, and he wrote a paper on William James in which he talked about not only James, but his 50 years of incarceration. And I found it to be a very, very powerful paper. And up to this point, he had not said a word in class. And I went up to him when I handed the paper back, and I told him I thought this was a very powerful paper. You not only caught the philosophy of William James, but the poetry of it, and you've lived it. And he put his hand out, we shook hands, and then later in the class, for the first time, he said something, he made a comment. Now, I mentioned this for two reasons. One, because you cannot program that into teaching. It has to do with a certain kind of human moment that we experienced, the two of us. It was important for him, it was important for me. I also mention it because this country has something like 5% of the world's population and 20% of its prisoners. This program is sponsored by the College of Education. This program is just one of a very, very few, and most of those people in Danville-like places are not getting an education. And it is a place where and the students that I have in my class are very good. I mean, there's a wide range of ability, but the conversations that we have are as good as I've had with my graduate students here. And one of my students is actually published in the Harvard Ed Review. So you got to know that the stereotype of prisoners is not reflective of a large portion of that population. We need, as educators, to go where the people that need education are. And many of these are in schools, but many of them are not in the traditional school setting. Prison is one place where I think the Bureau could really begin to think about what can we do to extend education outward to those who don't have it and those who need it?
Actually, in one sort of way, I want to just extend Wally's idea about going out there to the world. And I think the grand challenge we face in education, and this institution faces, is simply a ground shift in the dynamics of accessibility. So, how many students in the college? Did you know we have 40,000 MOOC students that have done our college MOOCs, right? So, is that in our consciousness? What percentage now of our doctoral students are online doctoral students? So, one of the arguments is that none of these people would be able to afford to come here, and the only way this college exists, sorry, I don't know why this is so radical, is via, oh, that's better. So, the ground is shifting under what we do on a daily basis, and the way in which these students need to be served is fundamentally different from our historical practices. So if we try to bring boilerplate practices out of face-to-face and push them into online, which we do with crappy learning management systems, which we do with thinking that it's like a classroom, it's none of those things. The learning management system is not serving us well. So we're on the cusp of this huge change, and our college is actually now a leader. I think if you did a national leader, if you looked at the number of online doctorates in education across the country, I think you find that all of a sudden we're a leader in this area, and we need to be an intellectual leader as well. But also one of the great advantages is that the university historically is grounded in Western monasticism. It began with late, medieval Christianity, and the colleges of Oxford, and this place is called the College, and Cambridge, were about taking people out of life for this spiritual experience. A small elite who were going to become priests or going to become, it wasn't something for the whole of society. And the learning experience was about taking them out of life. Now, what we have now with our MOOC students, the 40,000 of them, and what we have with our online EDVs, we have people who are teaching all day. Maybe in prisons, maybe in colleges, maybe in schools. So the dynamic of what we do as people training a new cadre of educators who will be researchers as well as educators themselves has changed fundamentally, not only around technology, but about their social place in the world. So for me, that's the big challenge, and I don't think we realise the rapidity with which this is happening. And we've got to try and, rise to the occasion, so to speak. And it's not unlike the prison situation. It's the same kind of lesson.
Yeah, I teach in this room, so I know people can't hear me. Given the role of online education, I think that's a big challenge. Is it better? How can we make it better? What are people learning? How are they learning? It's a new medium, and I don't think it's really fully understood. Because if we can understand what people are learning, how they're using the system, then we can maybe design better systems. And I think that's gonna, it's not just what they're doing, but what are they learning, how they're learning, and what can, because I think there's still a lot that we just don't know. And there's individual differences. People learn in different manners. And how can we develop online systems that kind of expect people to do the same things? The other thing is, I think there is a big social component to education that you don't get in online environments. It's kind of hard to. So that's another aspect I think that we're going to have to dig into. I'm also not a fan of randomized controlled trials.
Having grown up in Lebanon, went through the Civil War, the grand challenge that we have before us is the very foundation of democracy and peace in this country. That is our biggest challenge. And it is a philosophical question, it's a historical question, and our challenge as educators is to realize that entrenchment behind our values, as right as they might be, is not going to change the situation. Our biggest challenges right now is to sort of realize that the reiteration of our values, which we all agree to over and over again, is not going to move us forward. We need to shift from reiterating values in every context that we have to think about philosophy, curriculum, instruction, engagement in an age where trust in any claim is being compromised and can be manufactured, going back to Jim's answer, the bifurcation in thinking, the erosion of truth, and again, I'm talking about small truth, right? So don't take us down that pathway. That is our biggest challenges. And I can see this as a challenge where we need the historian and the philosopher and the critic and the RCT and the digital ecology expert and the AI expert. We need to be ahead of that challenge, because I worry a lot that if we just stay in our little places and keep saying equity, diversity, democracy, social justice, which brings us together, I hope that there's no question about that. But I'm not seeing the hard work of translating all of these values into thinking, programming, interventions, can we dare say that, and being ahead of this erosion of trust in public claim, in public good, in knowledge that we're seeing today. And so I worry a lot when some of our doctoral students, where I am, are coming to some of our faculty and complaining that some of the faculty teaching them are presenting themselves as experts in their fields. So I'll leave that there, but that's a grand challenge for us.
Thank you. Well, it turns out the biggest grand challenge is getting the microphone to work. Keep working on. So thanks for all the comments. And I think it's one amazing thing about the college is that we do have the ability. We have people in the humanities and social sciences, technologists, methodologists. We have everything we need here to work with partners on campus to address real grand challenge problems, have them have impact in the society. And that's what I'm excited. That's why I was excited to come here and excited to be part of the Bureau making these things happen. We do have a few minutes. I would like to know if there's any questions from the audience to ask our 156 years of research experience here. Anything that you would like to ask the panel before we break?
I want to say something. Great. Sorry, I just want to add something. Can I add something? Because I think all of you have spoken about the digital as important and the humanities as important. But one of the things we tried to do, whether it was that lab over there, whether it's the O'Leary building here, whether it's all the new people that we brought in, is to invent the tools, just like you say, for this new world that is human, that is engaging, that is just. The first generation of online is rubbish. It's upload, download, quiz, and maybe a clicker, right? Our job is to invent those tools collaboratively with the philosophers, with you know, as you've all said. And I think that's really important. And the college has shifted in that direction, and you, with the Bureau, have now that responsibility to enable us to go that next step in different ways. There won't be a single way forward. And I think if we can do that, then we will be ahead of the game and also resolve the humanitarian issues as well as the learning issues in this repertoire, you know, between the face-to-face in the prison and the 40,000 students online. Sorry, I just missed it.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Okay, in that case, let's thank our panel again.